Is this the podcast?
This is the podcast.
Are we in the podcast now?
Yeah. So,
Hi, everybody.
We don't have a name for this yet.
I mean, we do, kind of. So, first of all, welcome. My name is Tuisku.
And I'm Eppu.
And this is our Spartacus fan podcast called unofficially My Cock Rages On, or Our Cock Rages On, which is a quote from later in the series that has really stuck with us all these years. But we think that we can't really use that for the official title if we want to have anybody see this on YouTube.
Well, you don't think we can.
I don't think we can.
I think that's an act of cowardice.
Yes, but in this way, I will be coward. I will be a coward, and I think we're just gonna have it as the unofficial title. But yeah, this is gonna be probably on Eppu's side channel. So if you're watching this, chances are podcast. Chances are you know who he is. So do you want to introduce yourself still, very briefly?
Sure. I think in the off chance that there's people from the outside coming in. So this I'm a video essayist, I guess.
Yeah, you make video essays, babe.
And I'm a musician, I'm a librarian, and my general thing is my YouTube channel is mostly about, it's called Unfeatured Films. It's mostly about underground movies, art movies, and I try to be mindful and do deep dives on stuff that you've never heard of and actually never heard of.
Do you think Spartacus fits the bill?
No, actually.
Yeah, people have heard of it for sure. But I don't think people talk about it enough. And exactly. I feel like this is why, it is kind of in the zone that we're actually, there needs to be more Spartacus discussion out there.
For sure.
For me, I'm a comic book artist and an art teacher. And specifically, I write my own stories. And I have been a film buff all my life. My dad's a film collector, so I've been watching film ever since I was very little. I don't have any actual film education background like Eppu does, but I do have art and storytelling education. I have an art and storytelling background from comics and stuff, which is also visual storytelling. So I'm not a total rube when it comes to this stuff either. And I guess one of the big first questions that comes with this is, I think, why are we doing this? Right?
Yeah, that is Spartacus might not be one of those shows that really captures the attention in an analytical way.
No, and yeah.
It is mostly considered to be kind of an exploitative, sort of a trash show.
Yeah.
And most of the articles I saw really enforce that idea.
Also, by this point, it is 15 years since it came out, and it doesn't like you said, people have talked about it, but it doesn't really live in the public consciousness like that. I don't think there's anybody, or if there is, much respect to you, but there's not a lot of people who are really into the Spartacus zone in 2025.
Yeah. But we started to watch it over COVID lockdowns.
Yeah, so basically what happened, we're a couple, actually, if that hasn't been clear so far, and we're getting married this year. But we started dating in 2019, in September 11th, actually. And then we had dated for basically 6 months before COVID really hit. And at the time, I was living with some roommates, and one of those roommates had one of those roommates was a part of a risk group that was especially at risk for COVID. And obviously, we would have isolated anyway. It was during the first COVID lockdown, but they made it definitely even harder, even when the lockdowns eased. We couldn't really see each other for a really long time. We saw each other in flesh 2 times in 2020.
Yeah.
After COVID started, and then we we were basically long distance dating despite living in the same city at the time.
That was a real trip.
Yeah. And like before COVID had happened, we had been watching The Get Down, which is one of my favorite TV shows of all time.
I can vouch for it as well. It is great.
Yeah, it's also not talked about enough for sure. But it's good in a very real way that Spartacus isn't. Like The Get Down is like a show you can take home and introduce to your parents, whereas Spartacus is not that.
It's that wild boy you go out with every now and again, who rides a motorcycle, smokes and spits on the ground while drinking a big ass beer.
Sexy as hell. Yeah, and so basically I was like, so the way we dated long distance was that we would call at least once a week, and we're both big movie TV show people, so we were like, we want to watch something together while we're doing like these long distance calls. And I thought that The Get Down was like too good to be like watched that way, because you can't really, it's not the same experiences that you're both pressing play at the same time, because we were watching it like during the all right, let's both press play at the same time, 3, 2, 1, go method of watching a TV show, which is like with something as artistic and ambitious as The Get Down felt really not the ideal way. So I was like, okay, we'll keep watching The Get Down after like
all of this is
over, but we need a TV show. And when I was in university a couple of years earlier, I had some friends who were really into this show. And that's actually, I had watched some of the first episodes in the first season already at the time. But I never really got into it then, partially because I was a less enlightened person, and partially because I'm just not good at watching TV shows alone. And I wasn't like the instances where we were watching it with friends weren't like, let's all sit down and watch this, but we were like getting drunk and going out. But I knew it existed. I knew it was crazy. And I knew that Eppu was really into all of this kind of like more extreme stuff. And I was like, I have this really dumb sexploitation TV show that at the time existed on Netflix, that we both had it, and we were both like, all right, so we're gonna watch this now.
So I remember distinctly that you sold the show to me as, I have this show and there's a very big blood spatter in the first
and
episode. And I was like, sure enough, what the fuck?
And there really is. There's a really big blood spatter. I wasn't lying.
Yeah, that is one of my favorite things about the first episode, especially.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's go into some.
Yeah, no, I'm just gonna say first about this is that so we watched it in 2020 and we loved it, both of us. We got really, really into it, and we at the time, I don't remember why, but we made a pact, and we were like, if we're still together in 5 years, we're going to make a podcast, and we were going to rewatch this whole thing together and make a podcast about it. So that's what you're listening. This is the Spartacus rewatch podcast that was prophesized in 2020 during like shitty lockdown after we had been dating for less than a year and trying to make it work. And now we're engaged and getting married next summer and living together for the third year. So actually love wins and Spartacus helps.
I would even go as far as to say this is sort of a pivotal series for us.
Yeah,
a pivotal piece of art. But yeah, let's get into some background information. So Spartacus is a TV show that's about gladiators.
Yeah.
And it was produced in 2010.
I would even say it's about the gladiator.
The Gladiator. And it was produced by a channel called Stars, which is an American pay TV channel, like some sort of a channel.
Aren't like most of the actors Australian?
Yeah, but it is an American.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, and they have what I would call a spotty background. So when they first came to the scene, they were known for their really like short TV series, which were all like comedies, and a few of the notable ones are called Kung Fu, but it's like Kung Fu, like faux pas.
Okay.
And it is
Sure.
yeah, it is a very sort of early early YouTube type of thing
Yeah.
where they took kung fu movies and redubbed them,
Okay.
and the clips I watched make it seem that it's not really aged gracefully.
I can believe that. Yeah.
Yeah, the second one is The Bronx Bunny Show.
Also doesn't sound good.
It is a talk show with two hand puppets. One of them is a sexual predator.
Why's that?
What's with that?
You know, I don't know. I wish I could tell you.
That is a crime against good television.
From my point of view, it was one of the best shows to watch with your pants down.
Great. Awesome.
Yeah, and the last one is called Head Case, which is a sitcom about a therapist who
Awesome.
gives bad advice. So, very much in that sort of Adult Swim type of zone.
Yeah.
Very transgressive, very edgy. And Spartacus was one of their first original, full-length TV shows.
It came out in 2010, I think.
Yes.
It started, yeah.
Yes. And it came along with Torchwood, Miracle Day in 2011, and a show called Boss, which I didn't check out.
So is that the Doctor Who Torchwood thing?
Apparently, yeah.
Okay, so Torchwood, for context, is like for people who don't know, which might be Eppu, is like the adult Doctor Who spin-off that had sex and violence.
Yeah.
Also.
Very much in the sort of
It's
milieu.
in the stars category of shows.
Yeah. And finally, we come to Da Vinci's Demons.
Great. Awesome.
So, Stars generally seems to be kind of like this for dudes kind of thing. Like, they're really going for exploitation and edge factor and sort of blood and boobs type of thing.
You know what's interesting about this is that the show that people probably know, if they know any of the Star shows, would be Black Sails, which became a huge success and was like the second original show after Spartacus, like the next big one. And like that has really again broken containment, I think, a lot more than Spartacus has, and is like a lot more beloved, and actually has a lot of the same thoughts and ideas that Spartacus presented at first, which we will get more into later. But yeah, but Black Sails. So if you've seen Black Sails, you can kind of picture like the sexploitation aspect again, like blood and violence and boobs and sex. Though again, I think Black Sails, I was saying, is kind of like the Spartacus that went to college and has a nice job, like compared to Spartacus, which is just like in a back alley somewhere.
Yeah. These days, Stars is more known as a film distribution company. They show a lot of Lionsgate movies on their TV channels because they acquired them in 2016. And those who don't know, which might be my beautiful wife,
Yeah.
Lionsgate was a production company in the early 2000s.
I remember seeing their logo.
Yeah, and they made a lot of horror movies and thrillers and stuff. It's as far as I understood, it was sort of for people who wouldn't get funding otherwise. They would go to Lionsgate. They would get a medium budget to do genre fare.
Yeah.
So there's general understanding of Stars as a company.
Yeah.
And Spartacus, as stated, is the TV show about the famous Spartacus.
Yeah.
Which we don't really know much about. But this one really fills in with color and zazz.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to talk about it a little bit more when we actually go into the meat of the episode, but we divided the kind of background research part of this podcast where Eppu does more of the production design, filmmaking part, and I do a lot of the historical part. And truly, we don't know a whole lot about Spartacus. I think based on what I was listening to, we know around there's 4,000 words about him altogether from the original sources, which is not a lot. The TV show is surprisingly accurate at parts, But yeah, there's a lot to fill in. I feel like Spartacus is a pretty like a fruitful subject to really delve into, because like we know so little about the character, the historical person of Spartacus. We know enough that he's kind of become this amazing cultural icon and symbol, but we know little enough that there's a lot that you can fill in and kind of add your own things in it, which I think is really interesting. He's been an idol for all sorts of people, all sorts of movement. Two that are mentioned in the source that I was listening to are he was the favorite of both Reagan and Karl Marx. And I think that tells you a lot about, but I think that tells you a lot about how vague the actual facts that we have are, and how there's a lot you can kind of like interpret and add your own spin to. And if you see him more of as like a libertarian or a leftist figure, like, but I will get into like what we know about the actual historical Spartacus in context of the actual show episode.
Yeah. So should we get to synopsizing the first episode?
Well, I think, and the one question I think would be interesting is, where does Spartacus kind of stand in context? Because there had been Rome, the TV show, which we will look into a little bit more later, which was like a sexploitation show that was popular, I think, when I was a kid in the 2000s. And then there was Game of Thrones, which I think already in 2010 was... Has it started already at that point?
It came a year later.
Okay. So it's definitely kind of... I think you can... Like, this is me theorizing, but like the difference again with like Spartacus and Black Sails, which Eppu hasn't seen Black Sails, but I have, is that Spartacus really like kind of like Game of Thrones brought the sexploitation TV show and made it mainstream, and kind of it made it like so that you can kind of take it seriously and you can talk about it in serious circles. And I think you can really see that in Spartacus' approach versus Black Sails, which came after. Whereas Black Sails is a lot more serious and is trying to be prestige TV in a way that Spartacus is not trying to be. Spartacus is not attempting to be prestige TV.
Yeah, and I think like if we start to go down that path, the connection between Spartacus and Game of Thrones is actually pretty explored, even during the time.
Yeah.
I found a bunch of articles and discussions that were sort of comparing the two. And one big theme is that right up until the sort of finale of both, a lot of people seem to be on Game of Thrones' side on this battle.
That makes sense.
Mostly like citing that the drama was better and the production values were better, and it's much more of an intriguing show in a lot of ways. Anyways, when Game of Thrones ended, a lot of people flipped sides.
Well, that
because
makes sense.
The endings were so catastrophically bad.
Yeah, and the ending of Spartacus is pretty good. I think it is an interesting thing, because like kind of coming to what we said about like not enough people talk about it, to give the game away a little bit. Part of the reason why we were interested in doing this outside of our own little pack, but like at the time why we thought that there's something to talk about here, is that Spartacus is actually a lot smarter than people give it credit for. It's a lot more. It's smarter. A lot more interesting. There's a lot more. It's also stupid. Like it's. I think it's really funny that I feel like the people who defend it are trying to be like, no, actually, it's really sophisticated. It's not. It's not that. But it's also really smart and interesting, while being a very kind of openly dude rock cheap ass sexploitation show. And I think that like kind of tension at the core of it is what makes it so interesting. Like, for example, I saw somebody say that Spartacus is a feminist show, which is blatantly not true. Like, there's so many moments throughout the whole show that really lean into misogynistic tropes and, like, very kind of misogynistic ways of depicting women and female sexuality. Very exploitative, very, like, kind of doesn't treat sensitive topics with a lot of sensitivity and this kind of thing, while at the same time has, like, you can't make the argument that Spartacus is an anti-feminist show because it has a lot of female characters. It has a lot of really interesting female characters with a lot of agency and a lot of power in the narrative. Some of the best villains in the show are women. Some of the best heroes in the show are women. And it also kind of like it's true that it doesn't take all of the violence seriously, but when it does take the violence seriously, it has really powerful things to say about it. And the kind of intersectionality of these like levels of oppression, of slavery and racism and misogyny are explored in the show in really interesting and deep and profound ways. So again, like it's this weird mix where you can't really say it's like one thing or the other, because it definitely is both at times. And again, that's why we're doing this. That's why we're talking about it, because there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, and I think that generally speaking is the thing that makes exploitation movies so interesting, because they can and get to be a lot more complicated and outside of the norms of society in comparison to like a prestige TV show or something with a more with a higher budget or something to that degree. Yeah. But circling back to the comparisons between Game of Thrones and Spartacus, I found at least a couple of articles of note. The first of them being funeralwise.com. They're like a funeral company with an entertainment wing to them.
Hello?
And they did an article called 40 Kill Happy TV Shows. 40 Kill Happy TV Shows. That's the proper...
Kill Happy?
Yeah. So they they took like a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And they measured the average of people who die in 40 TV shows airing at the time.
Okay.
And two on the top were Game of Thrones and Spartacus.
Nice.
And Spartacus is like really violent compared to Game of Thrones. Like on the second season when this measurement happens,
which I would say is more people died during the second season than in the first one.
The second season of the 40, Spartacus was like fifth of the kills.
Oh, nice. Oh my God.
With 25 people dying on average per episode.
That's hilarious. I can believe that.
Game of Thrones, lousy as it is, only had 14 deaths.
Nice. So we're
episode.
winning, actually. There's a reason why there's not a Game of Thrones podcast.
Exactly. And if you thought that was kind of bonkers comparison or like a premise for an article, there's I'm pretty sure this is like a bot harvester content thing. There's a website called Ranker where the tagline is vote on everything. And they have an article called Why Spartacus is More Groundbreaking and Hardcore Than Game of Thrones.
Okay.
And I just want to express some of these beautiful taglines.
Yes, please.
First, the action never lets up. Okay, yeah, sure.
Sure.
2, it's a work of historical fiction, which automatically makes it better.
Yeah.
It has plenty of battles, which is distinct from action never letting up. The gore is more intense than in Game of Thrones.
And I would say a lot less realistic, which is a different vibe altogether.
Hooking up is a part of the story.
Is it not? I feel like it's also very much like a part of the story in Game of Thrones.
Number 6. Gannicus's confidence makes him a stellar character.
What?
Lucretia is clever like a fox.
Unlike like other characters in Game of Thrones, famously a show where nobody's clever.
Also, this one really broke me. Men and women are shown off equally,
Amazing.
which
is kind of true, I think, and not true at the same time. Again, I think it's interesting in that, like, well, I think compared to Game of Thrones, that's true. Like, Spartacus is one of those rare sexploitation series where I do think that the men show like as much skin, if not more, at all times than the women do, and very historically inaccurate ways, but still.
Yeah, it also says that it has better representation of queer characters, which, yeah, we'll get to that in later seasons. But the one that really, let's end on this one. Spartacus isn't afraid to slay anyone and everyone, which again is distinct from violence and violence and violence.
I love that. Amazing.
Completely.
Also, just not true. That's like not true to Spartacus's character, is that he's not willing to slay just
I
absolutely
think they're
everybody.
just referencing
The TV show.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
I'm sorry. Anyway, so I think overall the structure of this podcast will be that we talk about multiple episodes at the time, but we thought that we were gonna have so much of the preamble, introduction part, and also like my historical tangents, that it made more sense to have this first episode be more of like an introductory episode plus the first like discussion about the first episode, and then like going forward we'll do more episodes in chunks. So probably this episode's the introduction and the first episode, and the next episode is going to be 2, 3, 4 and so on, like that kind of structure. And so going into the episode itself, I think like to give a quick like kind of an overview at first of like what happens. So basically we get introduced to Spartacus, who is our main character, who at the start of the story is in Thrace, and he basically they're fighting against Romans. They make an alliance with the Romans at the beginning of the show, because they are fighting against a people called the Getae, which actually I forgot to look this part up, but they are depicted as these like strange orc creature people.
Very racially sensitive.
Very racially sensitive indeed. So Thrace at the time was an area between Greek and Bulgaria. So it's like around there. So I guess the Getae would be like Bulgarians from further north, which is not like what anything looks like in the show at all. Like it is a very fascinating depiction of them. But yeah, so Spartacus essentially actually wants to start a genocide. Like
it's like one of the
first
first things Spartacus says is like, yeah, we gotta kill all of them.
We have to kill all of the Getae.
If we are to align with Rome, the purpose must be clear. The Getae dead. All of them.
And we need to partner up with Rome to do it. And he, like the Roman general at the time, Gaius Claudius Glaber, and he makes a deal with Spartacus's people, the Thracians, to fight the Getae. But he has the funniest wife of all time. He has a really, like, his wife basically, who is the daughter of a Roman senator, breaks into the camp, and Glaber, who's been kind of unhappy with being given this kind of a bad assignment, why he thinks it's super bad, we're not really told. Rome generally loved expansion, and there's no reason to not want to expand here necessarily, but essentially he doesn't find the conflict itself like cool or important enough to really make an impact in the Senate court, and his wife agrees. So his wife kind of convinces him to turn against Spartacus and like break with the deal they've been making and take all the Thracians and go to a different front to fight a different battle. And the Spartacus is not happy about this, so him and his buddies desert, and they fight against Glaber. They kind of decide to embarrass him by leaving him in the dirt
While they kill all of
Well,
his
they kill
men.
all of these men, but they don't kill him as kind of a fuck you, which doesn't really make sense. But like, let's go with it. And then obviously, like Glauber, they go home to their village, and they find it burning. But Spartacus manages to really save his wife on the nick of time before she gets like murdered by these orcs. And then they are having beautiful, tender sex. And then the morning after, Glauber and his dudes find them and kidnap his wife and kidnap Spartacus to be to punish him. Essentially, they take him to Capua and basically kind of use him. This was a real thing that the Romans did, which was basically prisoners of war to be put into a gladiatorial ring and then used to kind of like using the gladiators as a way of like humiliation and execution. And that's what they want to do. But Spartacus is too cool. He's just too powerful, and he kills all the gladiators. And the local guy who owns a gladiatorial training facility sees him and kind of decides to pay favors with these people. And he's like, I can take him and train him to be a gladiator. He's probably going to die anyway. I don't know why he says that, since we just saw him kill 4 people while malnourished and tired, but that's kind of how it's framed in the show. So that's the first episode.
The racism of low expectations.
Yeah. And so now to go into the historical fact, like which parts of this are true and which are not. So can you guess which characters in the story are true? Like,
I think,
or let's say have a historical like person that they're using as a basis.
so my biggest expectations, well, we know that Spartacus existed.
He existed, yeah,
Yes.
for sure.
And since we know something about like senators and probably like other people who were in higher positions,
Yeah.
I would imagine that the senator is real and Glaber is real.
Yeah.
Glauber.
Glaber, whatever.
Glauber.
Blobber.
Is real. And I think maybe Batiatus, who's the guy with the gladiator training
School, yeah, who ends up buying Spartacus in the end.
But I think all of the other people, and even these, are heavily fictionalized.
Yeah, so almost all correct. So Glauber's a real person. He just does not show up at this point in the story yet. So he only becomes relevant much later. So basically what actually happened or what we know, again, like I said, we don't know a whole lot about Spartacus. The only sources that we have are Roman sources, which are inherently really biased against him. And so what we do know from the Roman sources is that he was a Thracian. Again, he was from that area, and he was a part of an army that worked together with like Roman troops, and he deserted. And we don't know why he deserted, what the context for that was. What we do know is that Rome was fighting like other Thracian tribes at the time, so it is possible that he didn't want to fight other Thracians, and that's why he deserted along with his men. And he got captured after the desertion, and him and his wife were both taken to Capua. So his wife is a historical character too. Oh. But unlike in the show, his wife is not kidnapped and sold to slavery separately. They're actually taken there together. And they get taken to Capua, and because there's no Glauber doesn't have a personal vendetta against him at this point. There's no punishment involved. He's just treated like a normal slave. So a little bit about like Roman slave. Basically, Rome was a slave state. And at some point, it is estimated that 20 to 30% of all Roman citizens were slaves. It's really hard to kind of imagine how big of a part of the society that was. And there were lots of ways to become a slave in Rome, including like losing all your money and getting indebted to people. But the most normal way was basically Rome loved having wars, and they loved taking prisoners from these wars and selling those prisoners as slaves, which is exactly what happened to Spartacus as well. And so pretty traditional. It's pretty normal at the time, unfortunately. And he was taken to Capua, and Capua was in Puglia. I'm sorry to every Italian listening to this. And Capua was kind of the center of the Roman gladiatorial combat training, actually. Capua was a major city for gladiatorial training. And gladiatorial combat was the number one entertainment thing in Rome at the time, which is really interesting. It was super, super popular, and gladiators became superstars in a way that no other people really did. So gladiators, many of them were slaves, but they weren't all slaves. Some gladiators were poor people who decided to join the thing because it was a way for you to become really popular and famous. And it was also a really good way to make money because the slaves actually were given a lot of money for these battles too. And it was a really interesting social place, basically.
Essentially, if we had gladiators now, they would be sponsored by Red Bull.
Yeah, exactly. Or like the WWE rock star, they were the biggest rock stars of the time, essentially. It was very emotionally heightened. You had your favorites. People wanted to sleep with gladiators a lot. It was a very kind of how people related to modern celebrities. And Spartacus was kind of picked out by Batiatus, who is a real historical person, was picked out from the crowd to be a gladiator. And why he was picked out is kind of we're told, again, we don't know anything about him as a person. All these sources we have are very biased against him. They're from upper class Roman perspectives, people who didn't like him and kind of had no reasons to glorify him. But even those sources kind of describe him as he was very physically, he was large and he was really fit and he was very muscular, but also he was really intelligent. These are things that kind of get repeated all the time. And you actually had one source of a dude saying, so he had to have Greek blood because he was so intelligent and kind of eloquent, because Thracians were not smart enough. Thracians were actually a nomadic people at the time, so they wouldn't even had a village the way they do in the movie, but that's kind of a different thing altogether. But he was sold as a gladiator slave, bought by Batiatus along with his wife again, and his wife followed him to the gladiatorial school, and they were there together based on the historical information we have. So that's, I think, the biggest departure from actual history, is that Spartacus's wife in the TV show is kind of this fridged wife trope more than anything, he kind of object of his desires and motivation for him to escape, where in real life they were together from all that we know. And actually, but so in the episode, there's this part where she has a vision and predicts that he is going to have this great and horrible future. That is also from the original sources. So during the slave market in Capua, this was kind of vague, but there was some sort of an incident with the snake, and that she predicted during this incident, with the way he handled it, that he was going to become some sort of a great and important character. And she was a worshiper of Dionysus. And this is really relevant because Dionysian, this is not touched upon in the show at all, which I think is a real shame, because the Dionysus aspect of this story is, there's a lot in it that could have been delved into and could have been really, really interesting. So for context, Dionysus, or Bacchus, the Roman version, is the god of merriment, party, revelry, all these things. Wine, sex, orgies, everything, pleasure. And Dionysus was kind of this god that blurred boundaries between people, between genders, between classes. So you had these big parties, bacchanalias, people who worshiped Bacchus or Dionysus had these large parties that were unconventional, that kind of shook these structures of Roman society. And Rome was an extremely structured society, both on class levels between slaves and free people, but also on gender levels on sexuality, everything of this. They were very stratified. Like women's role in Roman society was very, very strict. And so these worshippers of Dionysus were really scary from a Roman perspective, and they were religious cleansings based on these things. At least in one of these, 700 people were killed because they were like worshippers of Dionysus in one of these religious clearings. Like Rome was really intent on cracking down on Dionysus worship, and Dionysus was the god of Thrace at the time, like the god that Thracians really worshipped. And so it made sense that Spartacus's wife would have been a worshipper of Dionysus. And we also know that Dionysian worship has been connected to the other slave revolts that we do know that existed at the time, because Dionysus was seen as this like equalizer god that didn't care about your class and gender. So you can imagine that these people, slaves who have existed in a very stratified, confined space, go to these parties and suddenly they're kind of on the same level as anybody else in these orgies and things, and that would have like absolutely been a massive experience for them.
This is literally just like people going, if we all had a bong, we'd all get along.
Yeah, but
like,
it is actually
basically.
Yeah, it's very relevant and reminiscent of like the hippie movement and all those things, and also the same way that the hippie movement was cracked down upon, not quite as violently, obviously. Rome, I mean, Dionysian cult worship is kind of, you can draw these parallels between how hippies were treated and how kind of the present, like the similar levels of like I don't know, underground cultural exploration and equality versus these like stratified society things. This was happening, and I found it really interesting. That's all we really know, is that she was a Dionysian worshiper, and that's connected to a lot of slave revolts. We don't know if that was relevant like to their motivations when we actually get to the slave revolt part. And I think again, like, that would have been really interesting to explore. But I think part of the reasons why it's omitted is that they don't want the wife to be there, which is kind of...
It's difficult to say whether or not it's more to do with the dramatic tension of, oh, my wife gone, or is it just that they simply didn't want to have another women on set? Or...
I think it's about giving him like a thing to yearn for other than freedom. Like, I think had he been there with his wife, it would have been like too nice for the kind of show. Like, you really wanted that man angst of like, they stole my wife, and I think that's why they chose that. But I think it's interesting that his wife was apparently, like, we know up until the point where they actually start the revolt, that's the last we hear of her. So we don't know what happened to her, but we know that she was there in the gladiatorial combat school. And I think it's interesting that Bariados like bought both of them, that they were kept together like that too. That is fascinating to me, though. Again, we don't know anybody's motivations. We don't really know anything about Bariados other than his name and that he was the owner of a gladiatorial school. Glauber we know a little bit more about, but again, he becomes relevant much later in the story. The senators and all that stuff, those are all invented. They're not real. Some of the other gladiators are. So we know at least two characters. One who you see in this episode very briefly, his name is Crixus. He's shown in the thing. He was a real historical character based on what we know. And then there was another character called Onomaeus who is going to be relevant later. And they're both based on historical people. Everybody else has been like imagined for the show. But it's surprisingly like the big pictures there. The wife is different. Thracians are not really this, like I said earlier, kind of mentioned, Thracians were a nomadic people. They were really good with horse and archery skills, and they herded animals. So the way they're depicted in the show is kind of doesn't really reflect that. And
Yeah, because they're like muscular, sort of barbarian types.
yeah.
Like they're going there with their spears and axes
and
and
they're walking
swords.
around everywhere, and I think
Yeah,
that's a
exactly.
budgetary thing as well, obviously, but it's you don't really get a picture of what these people were actually like. But I don't think the show is trying to do that either. But
Yeah, it's not realistic by any stretch of the
it's not
imagination.
realistic. I think it is interesting of like what things it keeps from the real history and what things it doesn't keep from the real history. Also, I think a little tangent I also want to go on is to just talk about a little bit more about slavery in Rome, and specifically about the fact that so Spartacus ends up starting. We're not in this episode yet, but he ends up starting a slave war. Isn't that's what it's called? The slave revolt that turns into an all-right war, and there were two other slave wars that happened before Spartacus. And I think the relevant question here is that they were both pretty different than what happened with Spartacus. They were both Capua is pretty close to Rome, close to Naples. Both of these other slave wars happened in Sicily, so completely in a different location. And they happened for agricultural, from the midst of agricultural slaves. And the goals were also different. They wanted to start a kingdom. They kind of wanted to become independent Sicily. And I think part of the reason why Spartacus is so well remembered compared to these other two things is that it's so kind of dramatic. This idea of gladiators becoming starting a revolution is really it's a really cinematic, dramatic idea already. Spartacus again has this really interesting, even these Roman sources are really they praise him a lot. They have a lot of respect for him, both as a tactician and as a person, which is really interesting. And so he's become this kind of larger than life character. And again, it was a lot closer to Rome. It was a lot more threatening to actual Roman power. There was a moment during the revolution or the war where they were actually very close to getting to Rome. And so Spartacus it also became the biggest out of these three. And so it was the biggest threat to Rome out of all of them. But another question is that, why weren't there more of these? Like I said, there were so many slaves or enslaved people during the Roman era, and why weren't there more slave revolts or wars? There were tiny little slave revolts here and there, but generally there weren't many, even though Rome lasted for a very, very long time. And there were none after what happened with Spartacus. And that is largely because of how everything ended with Spartacus. But so the main big reasons are that Rome was incredibly harsh. All Roman punishment for slavery or for enslaved people revolting or doing anything were really cruel and extreme. For example, if you had one of the enslaved people were to stab or kill the owner, all of the people in that household would be killed. Every single one, whether they had anything to do with it or not. So you had this one very famous case where 400 enslaved people were killed from one household because of one person who killed the master. And the idea of this was to make it so that if anybody heard any talk of mutiny or any talk of fighting back, it was in the interest of those people to rat them out, essentially, make it harder for any solidarity building. Another reason was because slaves had such a varied, there were so many different positions you could have, and there necessarily wasn't a lot in common, or these people wouldn't feel a lot in common with each other. So you had these, a lot of families had Greek, learned men as kind of maybe live-in teachers and tutors who were enslaved. And that those people probably lived pretty comfortable lives. They weren't free, obviously. What was done to them was obviously wrong, but they lived very differently compared to people who were, for example, forced to work in the mines, who would live very short, very painful lives. So there wasn't really a lot of solidarity or opportunities of solidarity across these kind of boards, and truly like it was just made so incredibly difficult to do anything. The punishments were so severe, and the punishment for Spartacus end up also being like incredibly severe. But we will talk about that part more when we actually get there. So the episode is interesting. It's not accurate, but it is also, it has the overall kind of bones of it is there. I think the biggest difference really, is the wife, and everything else is more or less, and the fact that the Getair are like weird orcs, but like that's such a that's such a choice, and I don't think it's a choice that the show makes in any other instance. I had truly forgotten about it. Like when we were watching it again, I was like, man, I did not remember it started this bad.
Yeah, and I think, like, generally speaking, there is a weird racial tension that goes between, like, all of the threads of Spartacus. Like, pretty early on in the series, like, late in the episode, there is a mention that a lot of people will be excited that there's Thracian blood on the arena.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time, people talk about other people's, well, not nationalities, because nations didn't really exist, but like their ethnic backgrounds. Like, oh, we have this Gaul, we have this, Thracian, whatever. And it is exciting to see this minority get killed.
Yeah.
So, I do think that the orc thing is way worse than anything else.
Yeah,
but
for
there
sure.
is most definitely like a racial element to the whole series that's brought up with the gladiatorial games and their superiority and inferiority things. And I would imagine that even though the common sort of narrative around Romans was that they only had two nationalities, which was Roman and barbarian, that simply doesn't seem to be the case.
I don't think that's true.
Yeah, I don't think that's true generally, but especially in the show, it's like emphasized.
I like Rome definitely had this like Roman people versus people who were outside of Rome idea, but Rome was such a large empire that a lot of different ethnicities ended up becoming Roman, like during this time. I think again Thracians were, based on what we know, considered like lesser people to an extent, like with that one Roman writer saying that he must have been at least part Greek because he was so smart, which is but I don't think this idea of like, oh yes, we'll see Thracians die, I don't think that's actually historically accurate, like in any particular way. Like whatever, like the part of that happened with Spartacus that was like exceptional was what happens after he revolts. It's not the start. That like what all that stuff was pretty standard in general.
Maybe let's not spoil the show.
Yeah,
let's delve a little deeper. So we've talked a lot about the realism of the historical account and how it both succeeds and fails. But I would also like to point out that even stylistically, the show isn't thriving for realism.
No, it's not attempting accuracy at all. Like it's attempting these, like I think, signifiers of Roman culture. Like they have their little like Roman bangs and all the togas and stuff. But I don't think there a lot of attention was actually put into what people look like, what kind of clothes they wear, other than that they look like if you see them you think Rome, but they're not actually accurate. Like the fabrics aren't accurate, the cuts are not accurate, the little leather speedos are certainly not accurate.
Yeah, and I think that also kind of comes down to the exploitation angle of the show. Like if we think about what are the things you'd want to spend a lot of time like working on, it would be the melodrama, the special effects, and of course this exploitation angle.
Yeah.
So historical accuracy, as interesting as it is, probably isn't even in the top 10
No.
like priorities of the show.
But they do every time there's a chance in the original historical show to do something cool, or like in the original history to like lean into something cool, they will take that, which
Yeah.
I really appreciate.
We do appreciate Rule of Cool in this
Yeah.
house. I would like to delve a little bit more into like the general milieu which gave rise to Spartacus,
Yeah.
and the stylistic aspects. So the most immediate comparison when watching Spartacus is, especially the first episode, is 300.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And I think, generally speaking, from the mid 90s to the 2010s was a pretty good time to do these sorts of like historical, sort of barbarian, fantasy adjacent stuff.
Yeah.
And for me, based on my little research, it seems like Braveheart was really the breaking point towards this sort of like dude centric, like.
What was it? Who was it that called it like male weepies? I think Broe Deschanel
Yeah,
has a
Broe
really
Deschanel.
great video where she talks about male weepies. And I think like a connection to that cinema. And I feel like Spartacus is slightly too exploitation-y to really go into the trope, but it kind of also at times
Yeah, for sure.
fits.
For
like
sure.
the Gladiator also.
Yeah, I was about to say that the things that
Yeah.
led to 300 being like this major
Yeah.
film was, first it was Braveheart. I would say that's the
Yeah, that
sort of
tracks.
beginning where I'd track the genre influences of
Yeah.
Spartacus and 300. Then you'd have Gladiator, as you said. Then there was Kingdom of Heaven, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I would put in, even though it's a little bit more prestige
Yeah.
than most of the others.
And very sweet compared to
Yeah.
this.
There's Alexander from 2004,
Oh, God,
Apocalypto,
yeah.
Troy. You know, you had a bunch of these like
Yeah, that's true.
these sort of muscular historical and fantasy fiction things
Yeah.
that led here. And then
Ancient hotties really battling it
yeah,
out.
and then you have 300. And
Yeah.
300 is a very complicated movie. Even at the time, I think it was, well, it wasn't really controversial, but it was an evil movie from the beginning. Just on the sheer fact that it was shown a bunch in Middle East to hype up army men
Oh,
to
God.
kill the Middle Eastern horde. You know, like this
Yeah,
is an actual
yeah.
thing that we know that happened. And 300, generally speaking, is very, very simplistic and
Yeah.
similarly exploitative, but I would say a little bit more evil than our boys had.
Yeah, I don't
Spartacus.
think the comic itself that it's based on is necessarily trying to do all those things, but at the same time, though, the comic artist whose name I'm forgetting now,
Me too.
Miller?
Yeah,
Yeah, Miller has also turned out to be a crazy racist, like
Yeah.
recently. So it was kind of there in the bones this whole time.
yeah, and if you contrast like what we said about the racial aspects of Spartacus
Yeah.
with racial aspects of 300, there are some very stirring
But-
comparisons.
But yeah, yeah,
But 300 most definitely with its weird fucking elephant-headed people and incest, like
yeah.
yeah, and I don't know. It leans a lot heavier into that. Foreigners are beastmen.
And that's actually like talking about Spartacus. Now that you said that, I actually thinking about it. This cast of Spartacus is like deeply multicultural. Like if once we get into the later episodes, we'll have characters from like all over. A lot of non-white characters, for example, in very heroic and important roles. So it's really interesting that they still did this like strangely racist start to the show. Very kind of like Spartacus is presented as very white, like also in like the signifiers, like the visual signifiers, but also once we get later into the show, like the Rome is the white power in the show, whereas our main characters are very multicultural and ethnically diverse, like in this rebellion. So it's interesting. Like I think based on just this first episode, it's a lot like more return style, like you could kind of see a right winger being like, oh yes, this is so real, whereas I think the more the show goes on, the more like those themes of diversity, and then also like the very explicit leftist themes come a lot, like they take a lot more like screen time later on.
Yeah.
And definitely better than in 300.
Oh, for sure. But there are only scant few movies that work on this similar frequency that are worse than 300.
That's true.
In that regard. But what I would really bring up with the comparison between 300 and Spartacus, the reason why I'm comparing those two is mostly because of the style.
Yeah.
Both of them came around in the late 2000, like aughts, essentially. And their whole thing was that they're both heavily like a digital backlot movies. And for those who don't know this term, it's referencing this sort of essentially shooting against green screens and doing the backgrounds later on, and they're usually digital. This is a funny term currently because like it seems that most of our movies these days are digital backlot.
Yeah.
But it is sort of similarly anachronistic term as like color TV or the talkies. Like it was a break of a technological sort of
and you
style.
can definitely see like the like I would say like in most modern movies, like saying Marvel movies, not that I've seen Marvel movies in years, but like from the clips you see, like they don't look fake, like the backgrounds look a little bit lifeless, but they look pretty accurate. Whereas with this, you can really tell that they're green screens a lot of the time. It looks like a set, and the backgrounds move in these weird, unnatural ways at times.
There are so many great transitions in this episode. There's a lot of discussions online about that one scene in Saw 4, which transitions between several different locations in one fell swoop of a camera. That happens like 3 times in this episode. And it is so fucking cool every time. I love it.
Yeah.
But going back to sort of the digital backlot, there was quite a lot of sort of precursion to 300. Like if we're talking about just the 2000s alone, you had Spy Kids and Cat in the Hat, which are very sort of different aesthetically speaking, but are very much of the same stylistic palette.
Yeah.
Or like technical palette.
Yeah.
Then you had like movies which came from comic book circles, like Immortal at the Time, which was Enki Bilal movie, 300 as mentioned, Sin City, Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow, and probably other movies which I'm forgetting now. But they all sort of explored the unreality and sort of stylization that comes with the digital backlot, which is very much similar to the way Spartacus does it. Like it is like not really going for realism, it's more going for this like emphasized like atmospheric feeling. You also had a bunch of like indie productions which ended up here mostly due to budgetary reasons, like the Letterboxd classic Despiser, which is a sci-fi horror movie that looks like a video game for most of it, and a lot of people love it. I'm still in the middle of watching it. There's also Bug Wars, which seems cool based on the trailer.
Is that giving very dudes rock these days?
For sure. And there was also Immortals, the Tarzan movie, which also...
Tarzan movie?
Yeah. Tarzan, like...
Oh, Tarzan. I thought you said Tarzan.
No, like... Tarzan. Very similar, like, if you'd have a continuum between Spartacus and 300, Immortals would be smack dab in the middle of it, probably.
Yeah.
Gods of Egypt was also... Clash of Titans and Wrath of Titans. There's 2007's Pathfinder, and these are more of the barbarian sort of high fantasy dudes rock stuff, but with the digital backlots / digital photography added into the mix.
About the digital backlot, I think like it's really interesting. I don't think that, again, like I said, like we've said, that it has become really a popular kind of aesthetic or a technique for a lot of modern movies. But I think that like it's not very well respected in that sense. You don't really want your films to have this background. Like, I mean, we do, we're freaks, but like I, I feel like overall the idea is that you don't really want them to look like these fake backgrounds. And I think that's another step in which, like, what I was saying about how Black Sails, which to me is like the next step in the evolution from Spartacus onwards, because it's from the same channel, same idea, is that Spartacus has this digital backlot type of very kind of outwardly artificial like look to it, whereas with Black Sails doesn't. I'm sure it also uses like it uses the green screens and these things at the time, but that show is attempting definitely to do prestige TV and realism and historical accurate clothing and all these things that Spartacus does not really care about. And I think that's been more of the trend also aesthetically in these shows. Sure. And that's kind of like the Game of Thrones made sexploitation mainstream and respectable. So all these sexploitation shows are kind of trying to look more prestige, and that means less of this stuff.
Yeah, I'd say so, but I wouldn't really put this on Game of Thrones' shoulders, because for me the break already like happened before either of these shows.
Okay.
And it's mostly that when we started doing digital backgrounds and like really like going into CGI, there was this phase when we didn't really have the capacity to do realism all that well. And we have a couple of those landmark movies that really broke the mold, where like it wasn't this attempt at realism, we achieved it, and after that everything before it became archaic and obsolete. And those movies are most definitely Pirates of the Caribbean and Avatar. Like if you think about what CGI was before that, you had a lot of people clowning on it, of course, but it was this new frontier, and we were thriving for realism, and it was this like spectacle onto itself.
Yeah.
Like CGI was new. It was here to stay, but it was still doing this kind of weird thing. And you could be a little bit more expressive with it because you were still experimenting with what works and what doesn't. But after we cracked that realism case, everything was just trending towards like, now we can do this like prestige. Now we can do these respectable things. And the only downside to it while doing it on sound stages is that, well, you know, a lot of animators have to die for it. But that's a sacrifice Hollywood is willing to make.
Yeah, I think that Spartacus also, it does change throughout its run. It does become like more realistic and less goofy looking, I guess. I think that the first season especially, I think they have a lot more budget in the later seasons than they do here. And I do think that part of these choices that are very charming, part of the reason why they look like the way they do were for budgetary reasons. And like, because they do keep the sexploitation later, they just don't look, it doesn't look quite as artificial. I think they have like more practical effects, bigger sets, that kind of stuff. But we can appreciate this for what it is. I'm not trying to like put them on a pedestal.
I would go even further and say that we shouldn't appreciate it for what it is, because they are doing like very interesting original things via their whole budgetary model. Like in Spartacus, is especially the first episode, I don't remember it being that big afterwards. There is this very specific technique I haven't seen anywhere else, which is essentially like you have all of the characters are like cutouts that are foregrounded and backgrounded by huge spurs of CGI blood.
Yes. Yes.
it looks incredible to me. Like, I know that it's an acquired taste with a capital A and a capital T and a bunch of TMs afterwards.
Yes.
But I've never seen that implemented anywhere
No.
else. And there is a sort of grandeur to how
Yeah.
it's executed here.
It's so extra.
Yeah, and it really works.
It does. I think, well, I think you have like rubbed on me in the sense that like I can really appreciate it for what it is. First time I saw it, I think I scream laughed at how stupid I thought it looked, but I can like see the aesthetic appeal of it like as this artificial thing also better these days, obviously, because like, you know, when you do the thing when you stab a guy and the blood explosion happens behind both of you into these big beautiful wings, the goal is clearly not realism. Like
Yeah.
they could have tried for more realistic. They weren't trying to do realism, they were trying to do whatever the fuck that was.
Yeah,
and
man,
it rules.
Yeah, it rules, and it like harkens back to that comic book artist doing like
that's
movies.
True. It that's again with the 300. Like 300, I think one of the bad things about it also that like I don't think it made the comic book transition work. Like I don't. It's weird that they took these designs that directly from the comic book and try to make it into movie. They should have thought about it more. But it's true that like it gives these like kind of interesting aspects, and in this case, like it has this comic book-y feel, though obviously as a comic book artist I'm kind of like what is a comic book actually, but like, you know, I know what is meant with that. I think another thing we should talk about this is like, I think reason why I like this show so much also, I think it is really well scripted. I really like the characters. We get introduced to a lot of them. We don't really get to know them in this episode yet, but we have some of the characters have come in. Like I said, Crixus was there in a flash. I like really excitedly screamed where I saw him, even though he does like absolutely nothing in this first episode. He's gonna be great later on. Spartacus is good. I really like the actor who plays Spartacus. He changes between seasons. And so the structure of Spartacus is kind of weird in that you have this first like season, and then you actually had a prequel season that came immediately after it, and then you had seasons 2 and 3. And part of the reasons why the prequel season happened like at that point was that the actor who played Spartacus got really sick, and he ended up actually dying, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And that's why in the second and third season he's been recast. And I do like the guy that they recasted as well. But I will say I do always, like every time I think about the show and the character, I do think about this first actor. I think he's so good in the role. Like I think is one of the key reasons why it works. To me, he really sells it. He sells both the like pathos and the emotion and like the vulnerability. I think Spartacus is really vulnerable in a way I find very compelling.
Yeah, and just like physically speaking also, he has a very interesting physique because he is very muscular and very, very toned, but also he has this softness to his face, and multiple times in the first episode, he's backlit in a way where he gives off the silhouette of Jesus Christ.
Oh yeah.
Which again, very crass, very glib, but works so well to sell that like savior type character Spartacus sort of ends up becoming later on.
Yeah. Actually, for historical context, this is all happening 70 years before Jesus was born. Around like Spartacus. Pre-Jesus. Spartacus ends up like the revolt ends in 71 BCE, and he would have been born somewhere, I think, in like 90 BCE. I have a really hard time understanding how after it goes backwards, but yeah, it's around that time. But I think you're really right. I do think they really lean into like the savior character thing, and I think it works. I think it does. And I think all the other characters are really fun too. Like I said, we get introduced to Glauber and his wife, Ilithia, who rules. They're so fun.
girl boss of the century.
Girl boss of the century.
Girl boss of the millennia.
She's like the evil Roman Paris Hilton, and it's so fun, and she's just so incredibly like something I really love is that both her and Glauber, and then also you have the other villain couple who are actually more relevant in this first season, is Bariades and his wife. Bariades is played by the guy who played like my only context for him is that he was the annoying brother in Mummy. And then like his wife is played by I forget her name, lady who played Xena. And they are also like, they have great presence. They have incredible charisma. They are a couple. This has like the best villain couples of all time. Both Glauber and Ilithia, and these two are like, they're so fun. They're so evil. So truly like love to hate villains. I'm so excited to get into the later episodes where you can really like sink your teeth into them. But already like Ilithia like running through the camp naked, covered in furs to go like have a fun sexy time with her husband while being evil is like incredible character introduction to like her and everything that she represents. And I kind of love how in love they are. Like they're so clearly like incredibly into each other in a way I think is super adorable, even though they're like totally horrendous.
Yeah. I think one more thing I want to bring up before we need to start closing down.
Yeah, wrapping up.
Is the like language.
Oh yeah.
Spartacus is one of those like shows that if you watch it in a close enough interval, you will start to talk like the characters.
Oh yeah.
And already in the first episode, we have so many quotable lines like
They're breaking camp.
Frightened little gashes.
Running away with their cocks between their cheeks.
there's a moment when Spartacus turned down by Glaber after trying to consult him on strategy, and he calls him
Pompous, arrogant Roman boy lover.
and later on he says,
Glaber is the most dangerous kind of fool. One with a title. True.
Ooh.
but my personal favorite line from the whole episode is this little ditty from a side character who's like really dirty old man, like physically dirty. I'm not talking about like he's just covered in mud, and he just randomly comes to the scene. They ask him something and he goes,
How the fuck should I know? They blow their fucking horns, a Roman dog barks, and the gods shit on me. Welcome to the fucking auxiliary.
just what an incredible line.
Yeah. The language of this show is truly like, it's also something I've never heard in anything else. Like I don't think there's another TV show that sounds like this. Like it's this really interesting, like they want to sound historical and also incredibly crass at all times. So there's a lot of really very inventive swearing and like incredible sentence structures. Like this podcast unofficial name, Our Cock Rages On, is also from just the line somebody says about themselves. Truly, in like it describes how wild the sentence choice is. There's another character that said during this episode,
that man has fingers in all the proper assholes.
And also they were called somebody slippery little cunts, and it's so delightful every time. Like it just brings a smile to my face whenever they say they're like the most crazy things.
It's essentially, if you crossbred the sort of bar brawl or dude bro with Yoda.
Yeah.
That's like sort of the vibe.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, and it's so unique and truly like I think watch Spartacus for the one-liners.
Yeah. It will change your life.
Yes.
But yeah, I think that's all that I had to say about the first episode. It is kind of a skim one considered.
Yeah. I think that like I think if I have to say like my biggest gripe about this first episode, it doesn't really resemble a lot of the other episodes. I think like so much of the show is about like the other gladiators and their relationship with each other, is that the first episode doesn't really represent what the rest of the show is going to be like. other than kind of like give you the aesthetic idea, but it doesn't really give you the episode structure or the episode conceptual. You don't get a good idea of what the rest of it feels like. So if you did watch his first episode and you were like, oof, I don't know about that. I think the first episode is the weakest of the whole series. And I think it's because you don't have these other personalities there that really are what makes the show work for me. I think also Spartacus's wife is a really weak character, unfortunately. I hate that she looks so incredibly 2010. Like, they didn't even try to give her, like, even sexy history. Like, Ilithia, for example, and Badiadus's wife, whose name I forget right now, have, like, historical hairstyles and historical looking clothes. And she's just like, weird rag dress with her 2010 bangs. And just like, it's so bad. And her stupid thigh rag that's gonna keep coming up in the show, like, just kills me. And you know, so it's all really uphill from here. So if you didn't like it, maybe give it another chance. After that, I think that if you are interested in the history, a lot of what I talked about here and will continue to talk about come from History on Fire. It's a podcast, come from a podcast called History on Fire, and which I think is a really, really good podcast. They do two-parter where the first episode is about all the other slave wars in Rome, and then the second one is about Spartacus's rebellion. So if you listen to that one, you'll get a lot of the same information. Also, major plot spoilers for the rest of Spartacus. I really recommend it. The only thing I would maybe warn is that when I started the episode to listen to it, the guy, who seems to be very nice based on my like social media deep dive, it starts the episode with like, thank you to my friend Joe Rogan for helping start this podcast.
Truly the biggest possible fucking red flag I've ever
Exactly.
heard.
And I was like, oh Jesus Christ. This came out in 2015, I think, the History on Fire episodes. So I don't know what Joe Rogan was doing in 2015. I feel like he's really become more of a person in the public eye after that.
Yeah.
Though I don't know enough about it.
Well, he's never been good per se,
No.
but he most definitely fell to whatever brainworms he has, like in 2020. I think COVID totally destroyed his brain.
Yeah.
He was bad before, but that made him way worse.
I think that like based on what I know, but History on Fire just seems like it's a podcast about like very, let's say, dudes rock type of history. That's the name of the podcast. So it's very kind of around these kind of topics. But the guy whose name I forget, I'm sorry, man, who runs the History on Fire podcast for forgetting your name now. But he seems to be a really decent dude, and he seems to do a lot of really interesting historical, like he's reading from the original sources in that podcast. So if you are a Spartacus historian and you hear some of the stuff that I've said that isn't accurate, please comment down below so I can change.
Call her out.
Please call me
Call
out.
her out.
But a lot of this is from that podcast. So if you have any other sources or thoughts, I would love to know them. And if you're interested, I do recommend those podcast episodes. So the Slave Wars episode, they're really, really good and interesting. And yeah, that's about all I have to say as well. So join us next time, I guess.
Yeah, join us next time when our cocks rage on again.
for episodes 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah. All right. Peace.
Bye.